introduction. I am Jason Vandermerve, your host for today's talk. I'm the Europe Engineering Lead for Strava, where I joined 7 years ago as an iOS engineer in San Francisco, but I now reside here in Dublin. I'm joined today by Brian Walker and Jeremy King. Jeremy is the Senior Vice President of Pinterest, where he leads the company's technical direction and oversees the entire engineering org. Prior to Pinterest, Jeremy held various leadership roles at companies including eBay and Walmart. Brian is the Senior Vice President of Engineering at DraftKings, where he oversees the global software engineering teams across all DraftKings product and platform suites. Prior to DraftKings, Brian held leadership roles at Akamai Technologies and GameFace Media. Thank you for joining us today. The internet has created limitless distribution for software. Apple and Google's app stores allow your apps to be downloaded by users in every corner of the globe. Search engines can create insatiable demand for a product that you can supply with just a few clicks. The world of software has a truly global customer that doesn't necessarily reflect the location of your company's headquarters. For instance, 82% of Strava's users are outside of the US, but 90% of our employees live in the US. So many companies like Strava are trying to figure out how to scale our operations globally in order to be closer to our user base and top talent. And so we've seen a shift in the last decade where the center of gravity of the tech world is no longer in San Francisco. Technologies like Zoom and Asana enable teams to be distributed across time zones and geographies. And with universities around the world creating top talent, we've seen tech hubs pop up in places like Sydney, Tel Aviv, Austin, New York, and of course here in Dublin. But scaling an engineering organization to be globally distributed is not easy, and many companies are resistant to the idea. Working across geographies and time zones is really hard. And if you are a smaller organization, there's no clear blueprint of how to get there. But then 2020 came around, and the pandemic forced us to adopt extremely progressive ways of working. So today, we're going to talk to Brian and Jeremy about how they have been scaling their engineering organizations around the world. We will cover how they have scaled not just their ways of working, but their employer and consumer brands. And we will look at these questions through the lens of a post-pandemic world. So thank you, Brian and Jeremy. Let's get started. I'd love to start today by discussing how DraftKings and Pinterest have been scaling globally beyond your headquarters in Boston and San Francisco. So first question is, how long have you had offices in Dublin and other parts of Europe? And what role specifically does the Dublin office play in your engineering organizations? We'll start with you, Brian.
Yeah, so we started in Dublin in March of 2020. Interesting time to establish an office. It was a critical element for us as we were continuing to grow as an organization. So DraftKings has transitioned from a single product company to a multi-vertical organization very rapidly over the last several years. And the only way we could really grow at that rate was to be able to expand globally, and Dublin was a natural, obvious choice for us to establish a core technology center, ultimately. And it's one where we're invested in the long-term strategy, right? A long-term investment, because we want to be here for many, many years. So it made sense in every sense of the word, right? Because it was a strong talent pool. It was the perfect bridge between where our Eastern European offices were for some of our technology products. Just a very strong talent pool to kind of build around and fit within our overall product strategy. So.
Yeah, Pinterest has been in Dublin since 2016. It's our global headquarters for Europe. And we have engineering teams that are focused really in three areas. The data warehousing group, privacy and trust and safety, and we have a growth hacking team, a growth hack team here as well. We have about 300 people here, and we're going to double the size of the engineering team. To your point, there's not enough engineers anywhere in the world to do all the work that we want to do. And we've loved the fact that Dublin has not only brought diverse talent, but allowed us to really get a team that can focus on a particular area. And we'll talk, I think, a little bit more about that later.
So you said you have 300 engineers here.
Not 300 engineers, 300 total.
300 total. And
yeah,
how many engineers do you have
About
total?
25 engineers, and we're going to try and double that.
And how much in your entire global workforce?
About 1,800 now. Yeah, we want to be 1,800 by the end of this year. So we're trying to grow very, very fast.
Yeah, and at DraftKings, we're about 70 employees total all in. About 40 of that is engineers, and we're not finished growing yet.
So let's dive a little deeper into the teams that sit here in the Dublin office, or perhaps in some of your other European offices. Where are the decision makers located, and how does collaboration happen between those offices and perhaps your headquarters in San Francisco? If we want to start with you, Jeremy.
Yeah, sure. I've built global teams all over the world many years in my career, and really the only way to build them is to give them a center of gravity, a piece that they own. And so we built a team that's really focused on growth engineering, the trust and safety. A big chunk of the trust and safety team is here, and this data warehousing team is here. And it allows, while obviously we're one app that applies to the entire world, but it allows the team not have to call in to San Francisco to the headquarters. They can run their autonomous organization. The product people are here, the engineering people are here, and they own it completely. That's really the best way to set up a global organization. Obviously, there's some places where European privacy laws, and we want expertise in the area to handle things that are part of the global stack. But the key is to build a huge center of gravity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and similar for DraftKings, what Jeremy said is we've had the similar experience, right, where the ability to have effective teams is really centered around that ownership, right? You got to have that local sense of ownership, top to bottom, and we've leaned in hard on that approach as well. So for us, the sportsbook product is the key element here. Europe in general is the center of gravity for us, for all our technology teams. So we do have engineering teams in Eastern Europe on sportsbook, but Dublin is a core center for that as well. And we're really investing heavily on maintaining that kind of ownership in Europe of sportsbook, where they have the full stack, decision rate, how to run the business, how to scale the business, even delegating the level of hiring they're doing, that sort of thing. We're really pushing that deeper into the organization where they can run, quite frankly, autonomously with very limited, if you will, oversight from corporate.
The fact that we're sitting here physically, right, feels like a huge success. And it's awesome to see us kind of starting to come out of the pandemic, but re-entry has been slow for many individuals and naturally places of work. So I'm curious how each of your organizations is handling the flexibility of being remote and here having an office, and kind of have you put in any specific procedures or rules, or how are you handling that?
Yeah, so this is one, transparently, I think we're all still figuring out, right? It's relatively new post-pandemic world, and it's one I think we're going to have to learn from and adapt dynamically. So for now, we have leaned in on the remote hiring practice, right? It's a key element for us for our success and our growth. But that being said, we also recognize the need to have that in-person presence. So as we've grown over the last couple of years, one of the challenge points I think we all struggle with is how do you maintain both the efficiency of that in-person presence and the cultural elements, right? So many of the people we've hired have never been to the office over the last couple of years. So now what we're pivoting to is this hybrid approach where we're giving people the option to be able to come in a few days a week, maintain that level of flexibility that works best for the individual and their effectiveness, but also try to balance that with having that in-person presence so we could get those cultural elements, and also nothing replaces, particularly for where you are in the development life cycle, those in-person meetings, those whiteboard sessions, right? Those are incredibly valuable and effective. So we're trying to hit that balance approach. We'll adjust as we go and learn. Each region, each office, each individual are going to be different. So the key for us is just maintain openness and flexibility.
Right. We've implemented, we call it pin flex, and the idea is we pin everything. Everything is pinned. But our pin employees have pin flex, and the idea is to have teams decide how often to get together. And it's turning out most teams are meeting once a month or twice a month in the office and doing, like you said, the deep collaboration work and the really hardcore sprint planning and some of that work. But the idea is to let it be flexible. Like most people have very different situations, and as you pointed out, I think one of the things that we know, and our app is pretty complex, and we're working on an app that's reaching 400 million people every month, and building that kind of application, you need to have very deep, hard technical conversations. I was just with our engineering teams last week, and I saw some folks coming out of a meeting, and they're like, we could have never had this meeting remotely. And you talk about like the amount of productivity gain that you get when you get these teams together. And the other thing that I've seen, and I'm sure many of you, as you've gone back to see your offices, there's almost like this euphoric happening where people come to the office and they see people that they've been on video forever, and just the camaraderie and the team building that I've seen it's just amazing. It's really one of the most important. Pinterest is about inspiring people and like getting people to work together and get the community to help each other, and I just can't recognize enough like why we want to give the flexibility. We want to make sure that teams can really stay tight together.
The other thing I'd add, and as part of this, is being able to move your leadership team around.
Yeah.
So we're kind of, I don't know if you guys are doing this as well, but we're doing things where we're trying on at least a quarterly, probably every, say, I don't know, 4 months, 5 months, we actually move the leadership team around and have leadership sessions in the local country. Right. So Dublin is a perfect spot because we can easily fly folks over from Boston or Eastern Europe. So it's a perfect centralized location to have those leadership meetings, and it's a presence that you get to essentially transmit into that office, right? So the cultural elements come into place. The folks in the local region get more direct access to the leadership there, that type of thing. And go the other way too, right? So there's many times where we'll do planning sessions, where we'll pull folks from Dublin and bring them over. So I think being more flexible there, spending a little bit more in your travel budget, I think goes a long, long way. And I think we're seeing some initial success with that.
The other thing about that, not only the leadership, but it was so interesting to hear when I'm doing new employee orientation and that sort of thing. Like, people want to meet people outside their group, their team. Like, when you're on Zoom and meeting, like, they never get introduced to anybody. And so we've done a lot of obviously the sort of video coffee chats and things like that. But I'm telling you, when you come into the office and you're like, oh, meet this person from marketing that you never knew. I mean, it's amazing how we're kind of bringing it back to the entire company and not just thinking about your one team.
And is that something you've seen with some of the challenges in this kind of hybrid world, like onboarding new engineers? If a lot of your folks are remote, how have you been handling how you onboard someone? And they know 3 or 4 other engineers, and there's no pair programming shoulder to shoulder. Like, how are you handling that?
It's brutal. When we first started the pandemic, Pinterest isn't quite a startup. We're 11 years old, but we relied on that face-to-face communication for onboarding and buddy systems and that sort of thing. So we invested a huge amount in documentation and onboarding training. And I do a retro 30 days in for everybody that's onboarded to say, like, how could we improve the onboarding experience? And so we've had to invest hugely in tech writing and all this sort of video onboarding, number one. And number two, this, things that we did in the pre-pandemic world is like making sure you have a great buddy, making sure you're introducing your team, making sure you're meeting your cross-functional partners. It's significantly more challenging than we thought it would be, and it's been something that we obsess about at this point.
Yeah, similar for us too, especially depends on the individual, right? For new college hires, for example, it's critical for everybody, but certainly for that cohort, it's quite important. So yeah. We've been investing in similar kind of remote buddying. That said, we're also investing a lot in now what we call team enablement. So the full kind of profile of what ultimately teams need to be successful. So certainly the individual onboarding is a key piece of that, but also the overall effectiveness of the team. So we actually have centralized functions, whether they be architecture, DevOps, those types of things. We actually build workshops to focus on, we have a huge theme where we want the local teams to both build and own what they have, right? So they're responsible for the full stack of what they have to deliver. They're also responsible for supporting it in a live production environment. So making sure that they can do that in a robust way. Having that focus on essentially team enablement and, by design, going in and doing, training sessions, workshops, that sort of thing that get at that has been a big benefit for us.
It's interesting. I always ask in the retros when people come in, like, would you rather have done this in person? Mm-hmm. And it turns out like 75% of the people say yes, but that gets to the point of, like, there is some real differences in people's willingness to come in the office and just making it really enabled for flexible workforce. So they also, what we found too, is we did a lot of videos of sort of our onboarding process and our technical architecture and that sort of thing. It doesn't go over as well. They want a live version of the overview so they can do Q&As. That's recorded so they can go back. And so you want kind of both, the best of both worlds. And it's kind of interesting to sort of fumble through these processes as you go through. And yeah, the other thing is like, you mentioned iOS engineers. Like we had sort of a standard, software engineering track for training. And what you find is like, oh, we need very specific iOS training and very specific Android training. And so it's been challenging to kind of put together these tracks of onboarding. I'm sure many companies are going through this as well. You have to really invest in this area.
Yeah, well, what I'm hearing is the intentionality that is needed in every corner of your organization is so much higher than perhaps before. Even how you do one-on-ones over Zoom versus in San Francisco, it would always be walking for me with someone, grabbing a coffee, and that's much more casual than staring at someone over Zoom. I'm curious, have you noticed any trends with like attrition and how that has affected your org differently in the last few years than perhaps before?
Yeah, I think we certainly find the attrition rate by number has been consistent for us over the last couple of years. So that hasn't like ballooned in any particular way. The piece that's different though is because of that remote nature, the connective tissue that you have at a personal level isn't naturally there for folks that have been here, say, 2 years or less, because they've never been into an office setting. So maintaining that, again, that human connection, that identity with our local group is difficult in a purely remote environment. So that's the one I think we're indexing hard on, because it's much easier to take a phone call if you don't really have that personal connection with your team on a face-to-face basis, right? So we're hoping the hybrid thing will help some of that. But that's been one area I think that we've been concerned about as it relates to, the attrition trends we have seen, is because they've never formed that deeper connection with the team in the beginning, right?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I'm a member of a pretty large group of CTOs that gets together regularly, and this is one of the topics we talk about as CTOs all the time. Pre-pandemic, most companies' first-year attrition rate, people who don't make it to the first year, is usually less than 1%. Post-pandemic, in many companies, it's doubled, tripled, or quadrupled. And so what you think about the problems you're having: one, you don't know how to interview remotely. You haven't figured that out yet. Number two, your onboarding processes suck, right? Or number three, you've hired mercenaries who will jump over to the next company for 10 grand more or whatever. And so you really need to think about this from a culture standpoint, an onboarding standpoint, interviewing standpoint. Back to your point, it's literally the whole company has to figure this out.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to jump to your consumer brand a little bit.
Sure.
And I'd love to hear just, a little bit into the weeds of your product. How are you growing your consumer brand and your product usage in Europe?
Pinterest, the good news about Pinterest is pretty much everyone knows what Pinterest is. And so when you come into a market, and not only that, we get a lot of love. A lot of people love our product in a lot of ways. So really it's about telling people that we're here, right? So we opened an office recently in Warsaw, and you found out the number of people that just love Pinterest in Warsaw. And just, again, there's a huge amount of competition like in Dublin for engineers and in Warsaw, but it's like, we're here, here's what we're building, how do you get out there? So we do a lot of brand marketing on the engineering channels. We're doing a lot of like meetups at the offices and just sort of building the presence in country. And there's really no way around that. You just got to keep beating the street. We just did a big recruiting event in our Mexico City office, and are trying to hire engineers down there as well. And again, it's just like putting billboards on the walls and saying, hey, Pinterest has arrived, come work here. So it is about really, investing in the tech community across the board.
Yeah, for our DraftKings and a consumer-facing brand, we have our daily fantasy sports product that's available here, and one that certainly gets a fair amount of attention, and one that we would promote. I think the other thing we hear from a consumer brand point of view is because there is generally European-based attention to North America sports, right? And that's where we're certainly investing a lot when you look at the growth of our business. North America, from a legal sports betting perspective, is the high growth area in the globe right now. So we're investing a ton there, and that has some exposure to folks that follow American sports or North America sports here in Europe. So that's really where a lot of our attention is. We also spend a huge amount of efforts and continue to do so on the employee brand, which we'll talk about a little later.
Yeah, let's dive into that a little bit and maybe go into the weeds. In the U.S., university recruiting is a big thing, right? It's where you get a lot of your new college grads and new employees. I'm curious, is that something you have been doing here in Europe as well, recruiting at universities?
Yeah, so for us, when we were first establishing the office, what we did is we actually transplanted folks from our Boston area to start to see the office and then build senior talent around them. So that was the first phase of it. Now that we're successfully moving into that portion, we're going to be emphasizing a lot more on the recruitment of the college graduates. I think we've certainly had huge success in that in North America. That's been such a foundational reason for our successful organic growth, and we're going to follow that same model here in Dublin. But the core for us in the beginning, when we were establishing a strong team, was to hire senior talent to begin with, and now we're going to swing back to focusing on really building out at that core starting level ultimately.
It's very similar for us. We not only have a big university recruitment program in the US, and we're building it here, but also we have an apprentice program, which helps us bring in talent that didn't necessarily go to college for software engineering and that sort of thing, really to increase our representation in our groups. Pinterest is a place that we want to inspire the entire world with our product, and it's really hard to do if you have, you don't have a diverse engineering group. So we're trying to invest hugely in that area. I have a particular interest in bringing more women into technology. Since I've joined Pinterest, we've increased our women engineers up to like 31%, which is pretty good in a general software engineering space. But there's no reason it shouldn't be 50%, right? We have a product that effectively is used by 50% women, 50% men. We should be like looking to have our represented by our consumer base. So we try and invest super heavy in that as well.
Are there specific roles that you have found to be more difficult to hire in Dublin, or easier, perhaps?
It seems like every role is hard. We've been looking for iOS and Android engineers in particular. You want a job? I know that's what you're saying. Our technology is pretty complex, so we're looking for people who've worked on pretty scaled systems. We have a great training program as well, but we want folks that have worked on massive scale and data warehousing and so the machine learning space in particular, and that's where the university programs are really good. We can connect right in with the colleges and fit that in. But it seems like all of the above, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for DraftKings, it would be a similar story ultimately. The biggest challenge on our end is, we ask a lot of our software engineers. As mentioned before, it's not just, hey, you're building a capability, whether it's back end or front end. You own the whole thing, so they need to have some good understanding, or at least the capability to learn systems engineering, so they can understand the nature of how things are going to work at scale. The piece that's part of the attractive factor, really, that we use to sell DraftKings from an engineering point of view. The domain that we operate in is one that's incredibly unique. Certainly, e-commerce players certainly have their high volumes and so forth, but it is arguably very predictable. DraftKings is the uber high volumes. However, the load is a function of scoring events that happen at live sports events. So the natural impulse function of that is incredibly hard technically, on top of having to deal with challenges of, we have live sporting events for baseball that run by pitch kind of thing. So there's some incredibly complex technical challenges, and that's really a hook for us from a recruiting point of view to kind of offer that to engineers to learn and grow in that capacity. So it's really getting what I call that T-shaped engineer at the senior level. That's a real challenge for us.
So you've heard it here. If you're contemplating a career in engineering, mobile or data or machine learning,
exactly.
There's a reason I don't code anymore, Jeremy. So I don't think you want my resume. What kind of advice would you give to a company that either an American company or European company that's saying, hey, let's open an office in Dublin? What kind of advice would you give to them as they start that endeavor?
Yeah, I think from our experience, it's a no-brainer. Dublin is a great choice. You're going to start with a very strong position that way. The piece that I would counsel is, first off, if you can transport people over from your core office and build around a kernel team is quite helpful, rather than just trying to build purely organic, is one. And then the second is pay attention to, while you want to understand and bring over your kind of corporate culture elements, engineering culture elements, also be attentive to the local needs and messaging within region in Dublin, right? So there are certainly resonating elements that are unique to Dublin that wouldn't necessarily apply in other tech regions that we have, for example. So be dialed in and sensitive. We were talking about that just before the meeting of like, how do you post a job description? What works in North America isn't necessarily going to yield the best search results for talented engineering talent that are looking for new opportunities here in Dublin. So you have to be sensitive to those nuances.
That's great advice. I think the other big thing is like figuring out the element that you can let go from the core. I mean, how many times have you talked to the software engineering team? It's like, hey, we're going to move the growth engineering team. We're like, no, you can't move the growth engineering team, right? So like, and some of this essentially has to be top down from the CTO. We're moving the growth engineering team to Dublin, right? And so I find a lot of CTOs that have a hard time. They want to run this hybrid team thing, and you find out, sure, you could build up a team for a while, and then everyone hates their job, right? You can't. You end up with these endless coordination meetings and that sort of thing. So you just got to be just brutal about saying, we're moving this team. In 6 months, it's going to be 100% over there, right? And it can be really hard to make those calls, right?
I love that, and I can't emphasize that enough, is that ownership is so important, right? Whether it's Dublin or any other location, you got to let go, and you got to let them run, right? You're hiring talented people, let them figure it out. We're spending a lot of focus now on the team empowerment on the how piece, right? That's part of the equation for us is, okay, here's your boundary, here's what you own, but also incumbent on that is you got to have ownership for how you do things, and I want to see proof points that you're spending time thinking about how you're running your business and be able to tell a story where you're continually improving. So I think providing those boundary limits that are very clear and to kind of get that accountability is so important.
Yeah. I love that advice of really committing to building the office here. I'm in the limbo state of Strava just started doing this in March, and so I'm in that in that process of the full commitment, and it's hard. It's hard when the majority of your meetings are a completely different time zone, and hiring is hard and slow, and the folks that are in that process, it's messy and tough, and just think about them. I think we have 1 minute. I have this timer with green clock that's counting down the whole time. So my stress level is a lot higher than most of you right now. We'll get to one last question here. How are both of your companies investing in the tech community in Dublin?
Yeah, for DraftKings, we're, as Jeremy mentioned, we have a big focus on improving the diversity of our team. So one of the areas we're doing is investing in the Women Who Code elements, or Women Hack, those types of elements, to focus explicitly on building out the robustness of our engineering team. So we're going to continue to do more of that type of thing. It's so valuable for us to be able to both engage with the community, if nothing more than to be able to offer support for that important group, and then if we can hire great talent through that too, that's a win.
Yeah, it's the same. We obviously use our space for meetups and the sort of comment. I mean, it's just something, when you move to an environment, you need to commit. It's like committing to an open source project. You need to commit to be a contributor, not just a consumer. Like that kind of effort is just absolutely required in every country you're in.
The green timer just went red. So
Ooh,
I think that's
we're
us.
dead.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, and come
Thank
talk
you.
us afterwards.
Go.